Welcome to Cybersecurity Workshops. In this relatively brief session, we're going to talk about making files and directories. So we've talked about, let me go up a slide here. So we've talked a lot about, at the very highest level, Linux, why we use it. We're down into module 2 of this course on Introduction to Command Line Interface. And we've talked a lot about moving around the file system. We've talked about the basics of the Linux file system, how it's organized. We talked last time about how to list files, and we're going to talk some more right now about how to create files and directories. And if you haven't reviewed the previous discussions around the basics of the file system and listing files and etc., then I would encourage you to go back and look at that stuff first. Okay, making files and directories. Straightforward lesson objective here. Okay, so there are a few different ways to create files and directories in Linux. We're going to cover a handful of methods in this, again, pretty brief lesson. We're going to talk about, we're going to talk about the touch command. We're going to talk about redirection, which we've covered previously, but this will reinforce our discussion about redirection. Then we're going to talk about mkdir, make directory. So these are some ways that you can create a file. There are lots of other ways to create a file. There are applications that will create files when there's a text editor program, for example. So in Linux, I can open up the text editor, and I can create a file. I can save that file to the file system, and that would look a lot like doing it on a Windows system. If I opened Notepad and then I said, I typed in some stuff and I said save file, I could specify where in the file system to save that file. I can do the same thing in lots of different Linux programs. I can specify where to save a file. So there are definitely other ways to create files, but we're gonna talk about these three right now, and we'll get into more of these later on. So the touch command, quick and easy way to create a file. Any file created with a touch command will be empty. So you create an empty file. Why would you want to do that? Well, you may want to have a file in place so that you can dump stuff into it later. Is basically why you would do that. So I might want to, if I'm creating a few different files, and I'm going to go back and put information into the files later on, but I want to have sort of this basic organization of files, then I could touch all the files and that would create the files, and then later on I could go and put stuff into them. In fact, we'll do that during this session. If you use touch on an existing file, the last modified date will change, but the file contents will not change. So I can touch any file. If I touch and it doesn't exist, then the file will be created. So let's take a look. So I'm in my home directory, same stuff is still in there. So I've got file 1, file 2, file 3. Now let's touch file 4. If I do an ls, okay, now I have this new thing called file 4. If I do a long list, scroll up a little bit, here we see this new thing. So we have file 1, file 2, file 3, file 4. We have this new thing, and here's the permissions. We'll talk a lot more about permissions later on. Owner is the student, user, so that's the student username. Group is student. We talked about users and groups a little bit last time. We'll talk about more later on. And the size of this thing is 0, right? So it's an empty file named file 4. So if I use the cat command, remember cat, did we talk about cat? I think we talked about cat, concatenate. If I try to look at the contents of the file, it's empty file. But I've created a file. So the default owner is the user who created the file. That's the student user, right? The default group is the main group of the user who created the file. The ls-l command can be used to view the owner of the file. So we just did that. Okay, redirection. We talked about redirection back in Module 1 when we were sort of introducing ourselves to the Linux file system. So now here's a little bit more background on redirection. Redirection can be used to put the output of a command into a file. So the way we did that before was I said echo, then I had some phrase like hello world, and then I redirected into file names like file 1, file 2, file 3. If the file does not exist, a file will be created. The redirection characters are a single greater than or a double greater than. And what's the difference? What's the difference between those two? See if you can remember without reading the slide. The difference is if I use a single greater than, then the file is going to be overwritten. So if there was contents in a file and I redirect something else into that file with a single greater than sign, whatever was in the file before is going to be gone. Whatever I just put in there is going to be there. So you got to be careful about the redirect command. You got to be careful to make sure that if you think you're redirecting stuff into a new file and you put in the file name, and if it turns out that there's already a file with that name, then that old stuff is going to get blown away. It's going to get replaced by the new stuff. So you got to be kind of careful about that. The double greater than adds to the contents of the file if one does exist. So a double greater than appends the file. It adds stuff to the end of the file. So we'll take a look at this really quickly. So if I say echo, here is some stuff, and I'm going to redirect into something called output file. Echo, here's some stuff, redirecting into output file, which does not exist in my current directory. Now if I do ls, I get this new thing called output file. So there it is, right there. So now I can look at the contents of that file using cat, the cat command, output file. There it is, here's some stuff. Okay, so now we're going to redirect in there again. So I'm going to say echo, here is some replacement stuff, output file. Okay, what happens if I do that? See if we can predict what happens when I do that. What happens when I do that? When I do that, the old thing is gone, the new thing is there. So if I cat the contents of that file, oops, I did cat without putting in a file name. Okay, ignore that. Error on my part. Cat output file. Here's some replacement stuff, right? So I had here's some stuff in there. When I redirected to that file again with something different, it overwrote the contents, and I have my new contents of the file. Okay, sometimes I don't want to overwrite, sometimes I want to append. So if I were to say echo, here is some additional stuff, and I'm going to append into output file. I'm not going to overwrite, I'm going to append. Okay, now let's predict what happens. What's going to happen? What's going to happen is that new thing is going to get added. So now if I say cat output file, okay, now I have two lines in my file. Here's some stuff. Here's some replacement stuff, right? Because that's the thing that I overwrote before. And then here's some additional stuff. So that appended to the end. So that is creating files, a couple different ways to create files and then to redirect into files. Okay, mkdir make directory. Mkdir is short for make directory. Command can be used to make a directory in Linux. Mkdir command can use the relative or absolute path to create a directory. When a directory is created, the default owner is the user who created the file. Okay, so let's say mk, let's do a clear here, clear mkdir, my new directory. Let's do this thing, my new directory. My new directory. Did I spell it right? Looks like. Okay, so I think a new directory was just created. So let's look. So here it is, my new directory. Okay, what's in the new directory? Well, I can do an ls of my new directory, or I can cd into my new directory and do an ls. There's nothing in there. If I wanted to, I could put something in there. Some stuff in a file in my new directory. My new file. Now if I do an ls, there's a new file in there. I can cat that stuff. I can do an ls and list everything in there. So when I create a new directory, it's going to be empty, except there's always going to be a dot and a dot dot. That means the single dot is the current directory, the double dots is the one level higher in the directory tree. So this, when I created this brand new directory, those are the only things in there. And then I just created a file and I put some stuff in it, and there it is. And if I look at the information around that new directory, let's do the long listing. I see my new directory. It's got a D at the beginning. It's a directory. It's, you know, it's owned by me, the student, and I'm in the group student. The size, because it's a directory, is always going to be 4,096 bytes. It was created on March 20th at 12:48, and there's the name of it. Okay, so now I encourage students to do the hands-on activity associated with this lesson, and thanks for joining.